Okay, thank you everybody for joining me this morning. We're about to get started. I'll just give those latecomers just a couple more minutes to join in. Hopefully we won't be too long, and I hope everybody had a good amount of rain overnight, and the people that are really hanging out for it up north have finally got on the end of a front, so that'd be really good if everyone has got some rain. And I'll plan on kicking it off in about 1 or 2 minutes. I'll just give the people who aren't here yet just a chance to jump on. Okay, I might make a start now. It seems like most people are here. So first of all, welcome to the soil sampling webinar, and thank you very much for joining me this morning. My name's Kate Maddern and I'm a research agronomist with BCG. I also coordinate BCG's commercial soil sampling program, where we go out and soil sample about 200 paddocks for members and growers in the region each autumn. So today I'll be presenting on some theory and also some tips and tricks I've picked up off some long days in the paddock. Today was meant to be a workshop, but given the current climate, it's now being presented as a webinar. So I apologise if it comes across as a little bit dry, but by the same token, we'll make do as best we can. And ideally, I would still really like some audience participation. So just before we kick it off, just a couple of housekeeping things. So if you have any questions, which please post away, let me know as I go through the PowerPoint. You're welcome to post in the chat, which on your toolbar will look like a speech bubble. Or to bring up the chat, you might have to click on the 3 dots that say more, and then chat is the first one underneath that. The other option you can to post questions is to use the question and answers feature. So what happens there is you type in a question, you can choose to ask it anonymously or not, and then I will reply to that. So I'll be monitoring both those as we go. And there will be some question time at the end. Alternatively, if you would like to speak using the microphone, there should be a little raise your hand option down the bottom. If you click on that, I'll unmute your microphone and you can have the floor. The other thing is that the webinar will be recorded and uploaded later. I'll send a link around to the email that you registered to join in today if you need to leave at any time. So to get things started, and we'll make a start on the audience participation that I hope that works. Who here has soil sampled before? If you could post your answer in the chat, that'd be great. Whether you're thinking about soil sampling, you've done it once or twice, you do it every year, you don't soil sample but your growers do or your members do. If you could post in the chat just so I know what we're working with here, that would be great, please. So it looks like to kick us off, we've got a real mix. We've got people who soil sample every year for their trials. We've got people who soil sample. We've got people who did it a while ago. We've got people who have never soil sampled before, people who did it at uni. Well, hopefully all of you will find something useful out of today's presentation. For those of you who soil sample all the time, it'll be a good refresher. For those of you who've never soil sampled before, hopefully today will give you the confidence to go out and do it. So leading on from that, if you're soil sampling, why are you soil sampling? Or if you're not soil sampling, why are you interested to learn more and interested to start soil sampling? So if you could post your answers in the chat again, that would be great. Is it to make fertiliser decisions? Is it for research purposes? So it's looking like we've got quite a few researchers on board, which is really good to see. We've got people who are fertilising for fertiliser decisions. We've got people who are soil sampling for soil-borne disease and seed banks. We've got people who are soil sampling to decide which amendments are best to use. And all these are valid, really, really good reasons. For me, I think the biggest reason why we should be soil sampling is that the results can help us answer questions and can help us make better on-farm, or in this case, on-trial decisions. Questions like, what's the best rotation for this paddock? Should I be putting canola in here, or should I be thinking about a fallow, or should I be going back to a cereal? In this year, when we're facing limited fertiliser, you could be using soil test results to help you decide, okay, which paddocks really need it? Whereabouts should I be prioritising? You might be soil testing to help you work out, what's my yield potential in this paddock? How much can I grow this year? Or, as Simon has said, you might be soil testing for fertiliser decisions. How much urea do I need to apply? Should I be increasing or decreasing my MAP or DAP rates at sowing? Should I be spreading super on my pasture? Do I need to be spreading gypsum this year for my canola? Do I have enough sulphur? Could I be using sulphate of ammonia instead? Should I be applying lime to my paddocks? Will I make my soil better or worse if I deep rip or clay spread? And what's the risk of other questions, especially like Yassine's brought up? What is the risk of soil-borne diseases impacting on my yield? Can I work out the answer to that before I sow to help make better rotation decisions? Or things like that corner in the paddock over there, that never goes as well as it should. What's going on there? I mean, it's got plenty of moisture, but it still didn't look real flash in the header. Why is that happening? Sometimes you might see that certain areas in your paddock, like the rises or the flats or the slopes, even though you've had a good year for rainfall, you didn't see the yield that you're hoping for. Or it might be more long-term questions like, did the crop use all of last year's fertiliser? It was pretty dry, the yields weren't great, maybe there's still some urea sitting there that the crop didn't utilise. Or alternatively, you could have had a massive bumper harvest last year, and did the crop take more out of the soil than I actually spread? Or you could be trying to make decisions around what problems you're having with your soils. Are my soils acidic? Are they sodic? Are they salty? Have I got some toxicity issues? So this is just to get you thinking, but it would be really great if on the chat you could post on your farm or with your grower which question is the most important question that you need an answer to. Well, it looks like the crickets are chirping over there in the chat section, so I might keep moving on. But it's something to consider, and will carry throughout the rest of these this presentation, is what question are you trying to answer? What information do you need to help you make better decisions? And for me, that's where soil sampling comes in. Do you want to be making decisions based on gut feel guesses, or do I want to be estimating with evidence? Do I want to be thinking, oh, yeah, that lentil crop probably fixed some nitrogen this last year, so I think there's enough for my barley crop this year? Or do you want to be able to say, okay, there's 50 units of nitrogen sitting there in my soil per hectare. That's enough for a 2-ton barley crop. Okay, I know that, I'm comfortable in that knowledge, and then I'll wait until July to see if I need to spread nitrogen. Do you want to be saying, oh, I think we're sort of maintaining the right amount of phosphorus in our soil? Or would you like to have the numbers that show either yes or no, the phosphorus in my soil is increasing, decreasing, or staying the same? So once you sort of know, and that's where soil sampling comes in, it can give you numbers and quantities to help you make better decisions. Farmers are pretty good at gut feel and pretty good at aiming for average, but soil testing can help you make the most out of each year, rather than just, oh yeah, that's what we did, that was good enough. So once you start knowing what you're testing for and what you want to think about, it's important to develop a bit of a soil testing strategy. So I'm just bringing up an example here. So this is a single paddock, it's about 80 hectares, and we're looking at the yield map data. Whereabouts in this paddock do you think you might be soil testing? What do you think you might be soil testing for? How often might you be soil testing? So you think, okay, one paddock, yeah, I can probably wing that. And then you start thinking about it on sort of a block scale. So here we've got 8 quite small paddocks over about 400 hectares. They're about 50 hectares each. We're looking at NDVI here, and you can see there's quite a bit of variation across the paddocks. So then you start asking yourself the same questions. Where am I testing? What am I testing for? How often am I testing? Am I testing per paddock? Am I testing across the farm? It becomes increasingly complex. And then what most people here are dealing with is you've got a whole farm, and I understand that farm sizes differ across the area. So we're looking at about 3,000 hectares here. Now you start to ask yourself, where am I soil sampling? What am I soil sampling for? How often am I soil sampling? Trying to make these sorts of decisions on a big scale are really hard unless you know what questions you want to answer. There's not much good soil testing across the whole farm and then sending it away to the lab, getting it back. You get the numbers back and you say, well, that's nice, but what do I can't do anything with it. What do I do with it? So hopefully if you have a bit of a soil testing strategy or a plan in place before you start soil sampling, that can help with that. So with most people thinking about which questions are most relevant to their farms, most questions sort of fall into 3 main sort of groups. So there's the production focus, which is how can I grow the best crop I can grow this year? What nutrients do I need to grow my 5-ton barley crop? Okay, let's get that right. Other people are more concerned sort of about monitoring. Are the nutrient levels in my soil health or soil health changing over time? And then the last main category that some people fall into is problem solving. Why isn't my crop going as well as it should be? And now these are all pretty interlinked. If you're problem solving, you might soil test the same place 3 years in a row and sort of monitor it to see if what you're doing is improving, is making things better or making things worse. if you're production focused, you're probably problem solving as well. Okay, how do I fix that problem so I can grow more crop? Or if you're production focused, you might be monitoring and you might be sampling every paddock 3 years, and over time you can see the changes, especially if you've got a pretty consistent rotation happening. So just keep it in mind sort of where your question fits, because once you sort of know why you're soil sampling, you can help to turn that into a bit of a strategy. So there's 3 main ones, obviously based on the 3 main reasons, and I'll start with production focus because at the end of the day, if soil sampling doesn't make you money, most growers aren't going to do it. So you need information on a scale that relates to 1 year, and the area and the scale that you're sampling on probably depends more on machinery capabilities, i.e. variable rating, how that works out. And you're testing for things that relate to what you can influence with different fertiliser inputs. So nitrogen, try and make decisions about MAP and urea. Phosphorus, try and make decisions around MAP, DAP, super. Potassium, should you be spreading potash? Sulphur, are you using gypsum? Are you using SOA? Or moisture to help you work out your yield potential. So it sort of focuses on, okay, how do I grow the best crop I can? Monitoring, which is when you're taking information over multiple years and comparing it to each other. The essential thing with monitoring is that you need to be able to repeat your sampling process. There's no good sampling it one way this year, sampling it a different way the next year, and then try and compare apples with oranges. You won't be able to see what you need there. It's also important that if you're taking a long-term monitoring approach, that you need to have the management information as well as the soil information, so that you can sort of begin to factor in, okay, that year was a dry year, we didn't use up all the fertiliser. Oh, that year was a wet year, we had a lot more yield, we maybe should have put more fertiliser on. Oh, that year we had a pulse rotation, it was followed by a cereal, that's why we saw the nitrogen spike there. So if you're monitoring, while today I'm focusing mainly on soil sampling, it's also important to make sure that you're recording the right information as well. And you're testing for things in long-term trends that also relate to production. So things like nitrogen, phosphorus, soil carbon. You might be starting to measure microbes if that's what you're interested in on your farm. And then the other sampling strategy that you might be focusing your soil sampling efforts on is problem solving. So the area that you're sampling will probably depend on the area of the problem. You might have a whole paddock that's no good. You might have patches of paddocks that are no good. You might, if you're lucky, just have one spot over there in the corner. And if you're soil testing, try to solve problems through soil testing, you might be looking at things like predictive bee tests, which show levels of soil-borne disease. You might be looking at electrical conductivity, or EC, showing how salty it is. Exchangeable cations test will show up some toxicities, and also if your soil is sodic. Chloride and sodium as well as EC will show up salinity. And I would just flag that if you're soil testing to try and solve problems, it's really important that you test for nutritional issues as well, because the reason why that corner over there isn't going as well could just be that the contract spreader forgot to turn on the spreader for that bit. Or it could just be that it's low, it needs more P than it currently has access to. So if you're seeing problems, don't assume that, oh, it can't be nutritional, because it's pretty cheap to test for N and P. So now in the chat, which soil sampling strategy do you use, or which combination of production focused monitoring or problem solving do you try and use on your farm or with your growers? Yep, we've got one person saying all. We've got people saying production and problem solving, but probably not as much monitoring. So yeah, very few people will be soil testing with just one strategy in mind, but it's sort of important to start to consider what's the long-term aim of why you're soil sampling, because that way the results that you get at the end can start to feed into that. And Abby, you've beat me to the punch. I've got a link to the best practice fertiliser decisions in at the end. So once you've picked your soil sampling strategy, there's a bit of a golden rule that if you take nothing else out of today, this is what is really important. When you're soil sampling, make sure you sample the same management history on the same soil type. I'll say it twice. Sample the same management history on the same soil type. So a couple of days ago, I was out doing some commercial soil sampling in a paddock. The farmer said, just soil sample the whole paddock. I'll only be doing blanket fertiliser applications across a lot of it. Got into the paddock and half of it was a vetch hay cut and the other half was a fallow. So I took 3 cores in the vetch hay cut and 3 cores in the fallow. So I know now that the nitrogen results, well, the vetch hay cut you'd think would have fixed a fair bit of nitrogen, whereas the fallow definitely would have. It could have even lost nitrogen through volatilisation. Alternatively, the soil moisture results were the opposite way. The fallow would have had far more moisture than the vetch hay cut. So when they get the results back, what it's going to, and if they were to apply nitrogen based on those results, what you might see is that the fallow doesn't receive enough nitrogen to meet its yield potential, while the vetch hay cut probably receives a bit more than it should. The soil test results, because they were drugged back down by the fallow, we might see that the vetch hay cut gets a greater nitrogen application than it should. It could hay off if we have a dry spring. So it's important to sample the same management history on the same soil type. And the same soil type is also really important. I've seen quite a few paddocks where you start testing and then in some nice black clay, and then you get up the other end and all of a sudden the soil type's a red clay. So soil type interacts differently with nutrition, with water holding capacity, with crop production. So it's important that if you're soil sampling, it's important that you really are testing on the same soil type. So what does this actually look like when you start thinking about it? It gets pretty complicated. I'm just going to turn this on. Okay, so looking at A here, you pull into a paddock and you think, yep, it's all the same soil type. And then you come over here and you start thinking about it. You think, oh, actually there's a bit of a rise up in that corner. So it starts at a sand and it sort of flattens out a bit. And then by the end, by the other side of the paddock, we're probably back to a loam. So now we've got 3 soil types in a paddock. And you think, yep, righto, under control. Then you realise that they've actually split this, what was once one block, into 2 paddocks. So fence lines, in my experience, almost definitely never follow soil types. And I understand why. Logistically, operationally, square paddocks are so much easier. And I don't think we'll ever see fences following these sorts of patterns. But on one half, this then complicates the management history. On one half, they've ran cattle. On the other half, they've sown canola. So then you end up in it, and then you start thinking, oh, actually half that paddock we didn't clear that long ago, but the other half of the paddock, I reckon that was cleared back when this block was settled. So all of a sudden now we've got 5 different would-be zones. And then you add your management history back on top of it, and you see that, okay, this is really complicated. So obviously it depends on time and money and budget. Obviously it would be great if you went out and soil sampled all these different zones. You got specific recommendations for each zone, and that way you would probably be the most confident in your result. Alternatively, what you might do is say, okay, we're just going to soil sample zone C and zone E. That'll cover the majority of the paddocks, and near enough will just have to be good enough for the zones we haven't sampled. But it's important that you begin to consider these things in your soil sampling strategy. And unfortunately, I had to say it, but most of this is going to come down to budget and how much time you've got to go soil sampling. But it's important that if you want to make the most of it, that you start thinking about things like this. Turn that off. So the next thing is, okay, I've picked my zones out. Whereabouts in my paddock should I be soil sampling, and what pattern should I be using? So there's 1,000 different ways to do it. Your pattern will depend on whereabouts you actually take the soil samples, but especially with monitoring kind of soil sampling strategies, it's important that you use a similar process each time. So A up here, we've got a transect, and that's when you pull into the paddock in the ute or the side-by-side, and you pick a line and you drive across it, and every so often you stop and take a soil sample. So what that's really good at is it does sort of give you an average, but what you see is that there's a lot of parts of the paddock that aren't getting sampled. A different kind of transect is a zigzag here. This is pretty good. It's nearly as quick as a transect, but what you're seeing is there's a lot smaller gaps, and you're seeing most of the soil of the area get a decent representation of soil sampling. There's C, which is a cluster pattern. I'm not a big fan of cluster patterns. So this is when you pull up in the ute and then you go round, probably doing it with a foot core, you go round the ute. The problem with this is, if you're a bit like me, the places where it's really appealing to pull up your ute on a hot day is under a shaded tree, and that's probably not the most accurate. While you're increasing the number of cores, you're increasing the risk that there's still a lot of the paddock that's not being soil sampled, and it's highly dependent on where you stop the ute, which means it's highly likely to be biased. So if you're sort of, I would generally say that zigzag and transect are one of the better options here. Uniform grids are great. They're especially great if you're using variable rate technology and you send each one of these points off to be sampled individually. And then you can run it through software that will give you some really detailed spreading maps and help you utilize your inputs as best as possible. However, they are quite time consuming. They're good also if you're going to bulk all your samples together, you know you're going to get a representative sample, but they do take quite a long time to do. Random sampling is great. It's really representative. It's not biased, but the problem is if you're using a monitoring purpose, it can be really hard to try and get back to each one of these individual points. So it's definitely a horses for courses scenario here. It'll depend on paddock size. It'll depend on how much time you've got, and it will depend on what you're using your results for. So when you start putting together, okay, we're sampling based on soil type and management history, and we're also trying to use one of these patterns, it becomes pretty complicated. So it's easy if, so the example here is using a zigzag pattern, but obviously you'd adapt that to whichever one you think's best. So if you've got pretty standard soil type across the paddock, that's easy. You do your zigzag, you go home. If you are in a paddock that has different soil types, you think, okay, most of the paddock's pretty even, but I'll dodge those heavy clay patches. Yep, that's not too bad. Or you might think, okay, I'm going to test the rises different to the flats. That's pretty easy to see. And then you start thinking, okay, I've got soil types, but I also really need to avoid the trees because there's a headland around those that won't give me the most accurate results. And one thing I would recommend that if you're getting a contractor to do your soil sampling. If you're not doing it yourself, it's really helpful if you can give them good maps that show where the different soil types are. That will help you get the most accurate result. Most farmers instinctively know which parts of their paddock are black, which parts are red, which ones are heavy, which ones are light. But I can say when you're driving around in the ute, trying to think, oh, that paddock looks a bit heavier, that patch looks a bit lighter. There's no way I can get it as accurate as someone who's farmed on that land. So also when you're considering whereabouts in a paddock should you be soil sampling, there's some definite areas to avoid. Headlands, quite often they're double sown. Some people don't apply fertiliser to their headlands, and they're more heavily trafficked than the rest of the paddock. So they can give you an inaccurate result. Old fence lines and filled in channels, generally you can pick them in the paddock, but again, if you're providing maps to contractors, if you can mark out where your old fence lines were, that's really handy, especially given as most old fence lines are sort of graded at some point. They would have had different nutrition, they've got a different history, and same with the channels. Near gates, you need to come away from the gates, off the trafficked bits. Gates are often generally pretty prone to erosion. Around stock troughs, for the same reason. Old wheel tracks and stock tracks, they tend to be more compacted. They can tend to have had topsoil losses. Old fertiliser dump spots, especially if you're testing for phosphorus in the paddock the year after the canola rotation, if they've had gypsum there. Generally you can pick it, but if you were to sample that patch, what you might see is that the phosphorus results for that paddock are a lot higher than what they should have been. And again, near trees and tree lines, you'll see it in the crop that near trees have different water access, especially if you're testing for moisture, because it's had different rates of crop production to the rest of the paddock. It's probably got different nutritional things going on there as well. So to make the most accurate results you can get, I'd really strongly recommend sampling away from these things. Other things to consider when you're sort of making a bit of a plan up for how you might soil test. Budget is a massive one. How many zones, how many paddocks, how many depths should I break my paddocks up into? How many tests should I get done on each depth? I can't answer that for you. I would recommend working out which paddocks or which nutrients are your priority. Spreader capabilities should, if you've got variable rate technology and you're using that information to determine your variable rates, you probably will be soil sampling very differently to someone who might only change their spreading rate once across a paddock. Seeder capabilities also need to be considered. Phosphorus is pretty non-mobile, and most phosphorus in a cropping scenario is put down the chute at sowing time. So if you sample on your crop row or wherever that fertiliser tine was, you'll see a higher phosphorus result than if you'd sampled where the fertiliser chute wasn't. And because phosphorus doesn't move very much, it's important that the crop has access to it when it's quite small before the roots are fully developed. So if you've got a really accurate GPS on your seeder and you know that you're going back on top of last year's row, or you're going 3 centimetres to the left of last year's row, or you're going directly up the middle of last year's row, that's where you should be testing for phosphorus. When should you be soil sampling? Most people will soil sample in the autumn, but what I would suggest is look at it more as when will you be making decisions? When do you need your information from your soil test plus about 3 weeks to get results back from the lab? So if you're using your soil test to decide on rotations, realistically you're ordering seed in January. So therefore, ideally, you'd be soil testing in December, which I know is a bit awkward around harvest. Or if you're using it for phosphorus results to decide how much MAP you're putting down the chute at sowing, Then if you're sowing April, you might want to be sampling in March, or if you're trying to work out how much MAP you should be ordering, then you probably want it back even February. If you're thinking how much urea do I need to apply in crops, there's nothing to stop you from soil. Obviously it's annoying to drive over your crop, but there's nothing to stop you from soil sampling once the crops came up in about May for a GS30 application in late June, July. And it's also worth considering what information do I already have to help me to decide where and what to sample. Do I have yield maps or protein maps or NDVI, or most farmers will instinctively know soil types, which parts of their farm doesn't perform as well. And it's also worth chatting to your agronomist. So now, flashing back to this paddock I put up at the start, if you were using more of a problem-solving approach, where would you be sampling? What might you be sampling for? And if you could post your answers in the chat, that would be great. There's no wrong answers here because soil sampling is so individual for each farm. And obviously you're a bit stuck here in that I haven't given you much information about this paddock. I personally, if I was taking a problem-solving approach in this paddock, I would be sampling that this red strip through here, and there's another bit of one here. That's clearly where we're having some problems with the crop, and I'd probably, that's looking maybe like it might be an old creek bed. I know it's not, but what you might be testing for is things like leftover salt and those sorts of things, EC. Helen makes a good point, and if you test your low areas and test your high areas, at least you've got something to compare your results to, which is a really good way to go about it, and it also helps you work out nutrient removal from the low yielding parts of the paddock versus the high yielding parts. Simon was going to do 2 transects, one across the southeast section and one across the north. I could see that working quite well because that way, you, a bit like Helen, you get most of the higher yielding parts in it and most of the lower yielding, and you'd have something to compare to. And that's the other really important thing if you're problem solving, is that it's very hard to know what the problem is with only one set of data, especially if you're testing for soil constraints. You can probably work out from a soil test if it's low in P or high in P, but it's very hard to know that compared to the rest of the paddock without testing the rest of the paddock. And again, so this is the example of an 8 paddock block I put up before. If you're considering monitoring this block, where would you be sampling? What would you sample for? Again, if you could post your answers in the chat. I will say that, bring this back, these real red areas here, they are either dams or trees, so I wouldn't recommend testing there. What I would say is it really depends on what question you're trying to answer here. You might be interested, as Anne said, in testing all the yellowish areas that aren't performing as well, and continuing to test them year on year on year to see, okay, are we getting on top of the problem? You might be looking, imagining north is the top of your screen, these 2 eastern paddocks, they're looking relatively similar in soil type, so an option there might be okay. as long as they're going to the same rotations, maybe that's an option. You might be looking to monitor your nitrogen levels, your phosphorus levels. You might be looking at soil carbon. And Simon makes a very good point about EM38 maps. EM38 maps are a quite cheap way, well, they're cheaper than chemical soil testing. They're not necessarily cheap, I'll take that back, to cover a lot of land and get a good map showing moisture, pH, EC and those sorts of things. And yeah, again, transects, if you're monitoring, whether that be a straight transect or a zigzag, are really important to ensure that you can go back to those same spots. And I'd also be marking where I'm sampling with GPS points. And then one last scenario. So we're looking at this now over a whole farm scale, thinking about production. Where would you sample and what would you sample for? Obviously, this is a pretty sandy farm, but what I personally would be thinking about is, okay, where am I putting this year's crop? What's likely to need the most inputs? So in sandy country, I'd say they're probably not growing canola here. It would be a barley, vetch, lucerne sort of situation. So I'd probably be looking to soil test the paddocks in front of barley. And I would definitely be splitting the rises up from the flats. If you can pick it up off the satellite, it's a pretty dramatic difference. So yeah, now I've been through a little bit about why it's worth soil sampling and how you should be soil sampling. I'm just going to touch on a couple of little bits and pieces. So I hope that just to reiterate what I've said, it's a thing where soil sampling will come down to what works best on your farm and what questions you try and answer. A lot of people will ring me up and say, I'm going soil sampling tomorrow, how many cores should I take? And I say, well, as many as you can. Or how many depths or how many increments should I break my sample up into? And I say, well, as many as you're prepared to pay for. How many things should I get tested? Well, it's kind of the same thing. As much information as you can possibly have would be great, but realistically, it's all going to come down to budget and time, and no one has an infinite amount of both of these things. You're going to have to make decisions and you're going to have to prioritise. So again, in terms of zoning, the key message here is same soil type with the same management history. How many cores should I be taking in a paddock or zone? I'd say as many as you can. BCG works on that we take at least 6 per paddock or per trial site. Again, will come down to finances and time, and the best practice guide that I'll link to at the end has a really good chart in terms of how big paddocks are and how many cores you should be taking. How many depths should I break my core into? Like how many individual increments? Main thing I'd say here, especially in a cropping situation, is how deep is your rooting depth? If you think you're seeing stratification issues, I would say make sure that you break your depths up into a bit like a high and a low scenario, but where you think the problems are and where you think the problems aren't. And how many different tests should I get done? Well, what do you need to know about to help making decisions? If you're not going to change anything about your phosphorus applications, and you're using a production focus, is it worth testing for P? But alternatively, if you're not changing your phosphorus, but you're interested in monitoring it, well, then you will want to be checking it. If you're thinking about, okay, long-term, do I need to be changing my phosphorus decisions? So that's where having a strategy to help makes these decisions a lot easier. A quick note on depths, I would really strongly recommend that everybody, when testing for P, does 0 to 10 centimetre increments. P doesn't move around a lot. which I think I've said for the 4th time now. So testing in the topsoil where you put it is generally where it'll stay, unless you're on a sand, but generally 0 to 10. It just means that if you're testing for phosphorus between, say, a 0 to 60 sample, what you'll see is that it averages out a lot lower than it might be. Cereals and canola can put roots down to 1.5 to 2 metres, so ideally you're taking your cores as deep as possible, but most of the demand for nutrients will be within 1 metre. That last bit, I would say I'd look at it more as a bonus, and hopefully we have such a wet season that they're not putting roots down that deep either. Pulses, on the other hand, are shallower. They, in a normal season, will go to about 0 to 60 centimetres. So be sure if you're sowing pulses that you're testing at least 0 to 60 centimetres. And again, to pick up nutrient stratification, subsoil acidity, subsoil acidity, you need to break up the depths just to ensure that by averaging across the lot, you don't lose the information about the problems you're trying to solve. The way we do a lot of our soil sampling, it gives us relatively accurate results as we break it up into 0 to 10, 10 to 40, 40 to 70, and 70 to 1 metre. So that gives us 4 samples, which works quite well. If we thought we had a more specific problem, say we knew there was an acidic layer at about 10 to 20 centimetres, what we would do is we would pull that out and get that tested specifically to get a more accurate idea around how bad that problem is. When sampling, these are some things that will make your life a little bit easier. Remember to take notes on the soil type to help with interpretation when you get your results back. Most interpretations say between these 2 numbers for a clay, between these 2 numbers for a loam, and between these 2 numbers for a sand. It's not much good to be sitting at the computer with the numbers thinking, oh, that 60 to 100 centimetre sample in a back paddock, oh, I think that was a clay. So by taking notes as you go, that can be really helpful. It's important that you check for underground cables, pipes, and increasingly soil moisture probes before sampling. If you're getting a contractor to do your soil sampling, please give them a map of where these things are. That way they're not going to damage the soil sampling equipment or the pipes or the cables. Take an esky with you to keep your nitrogen samples cool. If your samples are moist and warm, the microbes that generate ammonium basically go crazy, and you'll see really inflated ammonium levels, and that means that they're quite high, but also you might be losing out on total nitrate results. So by keeping your samples cool, that'll help you get your most accurate nitrogen results. And log your GPS locations where you take your cores using an iPad or other device, and consider uploading them to AgWorld or whichever other software you're using so that the sampling points don't get lost. It's very easy to have Excel files disappear into a folder that you can't find them again. Before leaving the house or the office or the shed, have a plan. Know which zones / paddocks you're doing, know which depths, and know which sampling pattern you're using. It's a lot easier to decide this when you can see the map in front of you on your computer rather than driving around trying to guess at it. Take your sample bags with you and have them labelled. Remember to have 1 bucket for each depth or each increment when you're bulking samples, and make sure you take a ruler so that you're splitting, or measuring tape so that you split your increments up accurately. Have the GPS device charged and take a charger. Have an esky for the samples, and it's always a lot better day if you take your lunch and some snacks with you. If you're soil sampling during autumn, I strongly recommend the hot cross bun approach personally myself. Other little things to help make soil testing as accurate as possible. Keep your samples cool to prevent false ammonium results. Test your phosphorus where you're sowing next year's crop. And ideally, if you're doing moisture samples, weigh the wet weights out in the paddock. soil starts losing moisture as soon as you tip it out of the core. So to ensure it's as accurate as possible, weigh it as soon as possible. And if you're bulking multiple cores together, remember to mix your sample really thoroughly before putting it into the sample bags. So the whole point of this is it's estimated that each paddock has around 6,000 tonnes of soil in it. You go around and you take cores and you maybe end up with 1 to 5 kilos of soil. You then put it in a little bag and you post it off to the lab in Melbourne, and you've probably got about 500 grams, but I know ours are generally closer to about 300 grams. And then only about 10 grams of that actually gets put through the machine. So the machines are really accurate and the result on that 10 grams will be correct. But is that 10 grams representative of the 6,000 tonnes? That's where good soil sampling helps you to ensure that your results are accurate. Which test do I need? So this is a really quick overview because I generally get asked, oh, I want nitrogen, which test? So the two main ones are nitrate and ammonium. So they're the two forms of nitrogen that are readily available to the crop. Nitrate is generally really good. Ammonium, just be careful with how the samples are handled. Total nitrogen is useful. It will tell you all the nitrogen in the soil, but the nitrogen in the soil that's not nitrate or ammonium will need to be mineralised by the microbes before the crop can access it. So total nitrogen might overstate the amount of nitrogen in the soil. Phosphorus, there's lots of different phosphorus tests, so I've just touched on the 3 most common here. So coal oil phosphorus, that tells you how much phosphorus is in your soil. That gives you an overall amount. It can be unreliable, however, on heavy clays and in alkaline soils. And if you're getting coal oil phosphorus, it's really important that that's interpreted based on soil type. Another really common one is the phosphorus buffering indicator, or PBI, and that tells you how tightly the soil holds onto the phosphorus. So a soil that really holds onto its phosphorus means that there won't be that much available to the, as much available to the crop as a soil that doesn't bind at all. So this can help interpret with co-LP results because it says, okay, I've got this much overall, but actually the crop will only be able to access this much of it. And combining the two is DGT phosphorus. So this is a new test that basically uses sort of a jelly kind of thing. You put the soil on one side and you see how much phosphorus is pulled across the jelly. It's meant to mimic crop roots. So it's a newer test, and I would recommend that, again, you interpret it with care. If you try and diagnose soil problems, acidity or alkalinity, test for pH, but it's important to note whether you're getting pH testing done with water or pH testing done with calcium chloride, and then match your interpretation tables to that. Calcium chloride is generally the more common one done with soil, and it will give you a lower reading than what pH done with water will do. So it's just important to pay attention to that. If you're thinking maybe you've got salinity problems, electrical conductivity will show you the total amount of salt in your soil. Sodium is a kind of salt, and you'll see that in an exchangeable cations package. Chloride is another salt that's generally pretty cheap to test for. Some labs will throw it in for free with the nitrogen tests. If you're thinking you might have acidity issues, either topsoil or subsoil, the key way to tell this is if you get an exchangeable sodium percentage, ESP, which is generally part of most exchangeable cation packages, or you can get slaking tests done, which is when they wet the soil and see how far it spreads. Alternatively, you can do that yourself. Compaction, if you're thinking that could be the cause of the problem, bulk densities are really good ways to do that, but they are quite time intensive, or getting penetrometer readings done. And toxicities, most labs will test for most elements that can be toxic, aluminium and boron being the two main ones. So I've been touching on it a bit and Abby brought it up in the chat, but if you're keen on putting together soil sampling strategies and understanding this in a lot more detail, I'd really recommend this booklet. It's called A Guide for Fit for Purpose Soil Sampling. It's available online for free, or there are hard copies floating around. It was done as part of the FertCare agronomist package done by Fertiliser Australia, and it takes you through everything I've been over today. And finally, I would just like to acknowledge that this project is supported by the Wimmera Catchment Management Authority through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare project. So this is part of the Wimmera CMA Soil Carbon project that BCG is running, and we're looking at can we increase soil carbon in a dryland broadacre cropping systems in the medium to low rainfall zone. And we also have a similar project running in the Mallee. So it's a 5-year project, and part of that is extension activities like today to build knowledge around soil and soil carbon. We're putting together a data set of soil carbon test results combined with management practices, and we're running 2 soil amelioration trials. So if anyone is interested in learning more about that, please let me know. Finally, nearly there, thank you for sticking with me. Key takeaways from today is to know what questions you want to answer with soil sampling, and then design your soil sampling program to answer those questions. Sample the same soil type with the same management history is the most important thing when soil sampling. It'll make your results a lot better. And only 1 to 15 grams of soil from your whole paddock will actually be tested at the lab. So it's important to make sure that that small amount of soil accurately represents your paddock or your zone. So thank you very much for hanging in there and for listening to my webinar. Does anyone have any questions at all? Feel free to post them in the chat or use the Q&A session, or if you would like to raise your hand, I will unmute the microphone. The other thing is my contact details are there. If anyone would like to get in touch or ask me any questions, please do. Abby, it'll be posted on YouTube on the BCG channel, and what I will do is at the end of this I will email everyone the link to the YouTube video to the email that you registered for today with. Well, I haven't had any questions pop up in the chat, and it doesn't look like there's anyone who's clicked the raise hand button. So I'll just say thank you once again for tuning in. I hope that everyone has learned something today. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to get in touch with me at any time. Thank you once again, and have a nice day.